Today I'd like to go into the idea of living. I don't think there is an art of living. I think living really is always a learning process. I think we're always learning how to do things. So, each time you go in the kitchen, you could say it's a ritual and it's habitual, but I would say going into the kitchen is a learning experience. So there are always unpredictable things going on when you go into the kitchen, on every level. It could be to do with your nervous system, your emotions, your thoughts, your memories. There are so many subtle reactions going on all over the place, as it were, and as you're moving around the kitchen, then you're in a sense making more complications. But those complications are part of living. So I would say the human condition in which we all live and exist is a complicated affair. And I think the essence of that complication comes with the way we react and the way we think about what we're doing. And I don't find any problem with any of that. I don't think complexity or complication on any level in itself constitutes a problem. So in my own life, I would say that when problems arise on any level, to do with my emotions, to do with my body, to do with other people, my relationship, my future, what I'm doing, I would say that I don't necessarily condition my situation as a problem. So I don't actually think in terms of static problems. I feel more of a continuity throughout the day where you have varying degrees of complication. So I don't actually isolate a problem as such from that continuity of living and learning to live with complication. So getting it right and getting it wrong, say when you go in the kitchen, I mean, I often break things, spill things, burn things. I have a slight problem with coordination due to something that happened to me physically. So I have a slight problem with moving around and picking things up. So if I move an object from one place to another, like a kettle, I may hit it against the stove. Whereas before, I wouldn't have done that. So I just adapted to that. I just adjusted to that. As I say, sometimes it might involve breaking a cup or dropping a cup. And I think that comes out with children. Children, you might say, up until a certain age, wouldn't think of doing anything deliberately destructive. But you know that in the child, what might appear to be complicated and destructive and messy and confused you know that the child isn't conscious or deliberately doing that. And so the same way, if somebody has an illness, say emotional illness or a physical illness or something like that, you know they're not responsible, they're not consciously making it difficult. I mean, if you're up against a complicated relationship, then you can increase the complication or modify the complication by understanding what the relationship is all about. And if someone can't deal with the complication or the difference or the conflict, then they may break off the relationship. And I think we're free to do that. I mean, we're free to feel that things are getting much too complex, or you're out of your depth, and you might be going through something that's upsetting your nervous system, and you feel very frightened of your own nervous system. And you get confused and restless, and it's like an overload. You know, you're carrying too much, your body can't take it, your nerves can't take it, you know, you find it very difficult. Now, when does that become a problem? So all those reactions and symptoms that I've been through quite a few times, actually, where I've been quite nervous and I felt afraid. Again, that happens to me, may happen spontaneously, it may gradually emerge in the evening or something, and I may react to the situation. It may increase in intensity, and it's like being out in a storm. You're out in a storm, the lightning's all around you, which has happened to me quite a few times, and you seek shelter, or you have to keep on walking. And my view is that I go through something rather than isolate it as a problem. You know, if you're in a certain situation, you're out of your depth, as it were, and you think, well, this becomes a medical problem. I'm going to the doctors. This is a medical problem. I mean, that's actually happened to me. But anyway, you once you isolate it as a problem, then it becomes a medical problem. And then from that, if you take it to the doctor, then what was, I believe, just an integral part of living, an integral part of the complications of the human condition, as it were, then it becomes something entirely different. You've moved out of the overall movement of your life, and for whatever reason, you've changed the nature of yourself, of your relationship to yourself. I mean, I haven't been in what you might call a serious physical or a serious mental condition, in the sense that I completely broke down, so I literally had to be looked after. I haven't been in that situation. So I can't really say for that particular situation. But I've been in extreme situations, and where you have a sense of being out of your depth in your feelings and emotions, and things seem quite frightening. You might feel suicidal or think you're going mad or losing your mind or sinking into yourself, and depression, all that kind of stuff. Now, what I would call a psychotic interlude. So it's really, psychosis is a kind of mental disorder, or you might say emotional, psychological, physical disorder, you know, as a whole. And that fear of losing your conscious identity, or going unconscious, or collapsing, or totally breaking down, the fear of losing control, losing awareness, all of that. And that did cause me to go to the doctor, and I forget exactly what the conversation was about, but I came out of there feeling that he didn't understand, he didn't know what to do, or, you know, so forth and so on. And I lived through that situation. That was the first, what I would call, psychological crisis in my life at the age of 23. That was the first time I ever experienced what you might call a kind of challenge to my sense of self, my sense of identity, that had never occurred before. And when you're dealing with internal processes of emotions and nervous system, they're not easy to bring under control. You can't really, it's difficult to manage them if they're at a deep level. Anyway, that I lived with it, and from then on, whenever I met that kind of crisis in myself, I lived through it, and each time I learned about it. I'm not saying that I was totally positive and not afraid or not concerned or worried or something, or the reactions, but I think fundamentally, I mean, even when I've had panic attacks, which are quite powerful, so, you know, I might wake up in the middle of the night and sense that something is happening to me, but I'm not yet conscious of it. It's almost like a foreboding, that like something's going to happen to me, very subtle, and then suddenly I'm in a full-blown panic attack, which makes me get out of bed and walking around and wanting to get out of that state, but you can't. And the feeling is you're going to collapse, you're going to lose consciousness and black out. And there is, at that moment, the terror, the panic, is so powerful and very instantaneous that you actually think you might die. So I don't know, I haven't found out for myself what the relationship is of the panic attack to what I experience as the void, which was the situation that took me to the doctors. So right now, as I sit here remembering these things, I can see the fear. I can actually see the fear. So as I'm sitting here now, I'm not frightened in the sense that anything is happening to me directly, but I can see the fear, and I know the fear, I know the level of the fear, and it goes all the way back to the age of 4, when I was lying in bed. And I felt my body was expanding into the room. Whatever that meant, I didn't know what that meant, but I got frightened. And years later I found out that that might be a symptom of an out of the body, when you're going to lose consciousness and go into an altered state. But as a child, that sensation of the body expanding, getting bigger and bigger in the room, whatever that was, the mind-body reacted and maybe knew that I was going to lose consciousness. So the child didn't know, but the body-mind knew that that would lead to a blackout, that would lead to losing your consciousness. So when I remember fear now, I actually know that it's exactly the same fear as at the age of 4. So that threshold of fear must be a permanent part of my psychology. And the panic attack and the void and that feeling of being in a psychotic interlude is when the fear becomes totally unconscious. In other words, at the depth of fear sitting here now, I can consciously look at it, I can consciously be aware of it. But when it turns into a panic attack or out of your depth in a psychotic interlude or void experience, then your body-mind becomes totally alert to the danger facing your consciousness, facing your identity. So if you're walking around the city at night, and suddenly somebody jumps out and they've got a gun or a knife, then that's an immediate challenge to you. So your life is threatened, but more importantly, your identity, you yourself, your identity is confronted by a life-death challenge, which literally means, am I going to live, am I going to die? And that's what you experience in the panic attack, and that's what you experience in the psychotic interlude or the void, where the void in mysticism is, you might say, the threshold of negation. And that negation is that your identity, your consciousness, can't go into the void without blacking out. And that primal kind of fear of death, or psychological death, or the ending of the ego, or being out of your depth, or being taken over by something very powerful, more powerful than you, and that can be internal and external. That can be in a war, that could be, as I say, in a confrontation by someone with a gun or something. Now, when you're in that level of crisis, you can call it an identity crisis. then it's black and white. You either go with it or you don't. And I've always made the choice not to. So I haven't let go and gone into that psychosis, if you want to use the word. So all I'm saying is your mental order, your conscious control, your mental order breaks down into a mental disorder, but it can be emotional disorder or a physical disorder. I'm only using it as a crisis, psychological crisis, where you feel you are in danger, whether that's physically, psychologically, emotionally, whatever. Now, again, that's a very complex situation for a human being to be in. If you're in a war zone, if you're in a violent relationship, etc., that's very, very difficult. That goes beyond just being complicated. It's as I say, black and white. And by not letting go, by being afraid, that isn't a problem to me. So I didn't even on the most difficult level, again, I haven't made a problem out of it. So I came out of it, it was all right, I survived, as it were. That might happen again, and I might have to go through similar procedure. And I wouldn't use the art of living, you see. I don't think living can be an art. I don't think you can get used to living. I don't think you can get used to complication. As I say, you go in the garden, you go in the kitchen, you start relating to a person emotionally, psychologically. It's complicated. And I'm saying complicated as an activity. I'm not saying complicated in it's a bad experience. I'm just saying it's literally complicated. And I think the most complicated thing in human relationship is language. I think that is I think every human being today on the planet experiences the complication of language, because that's the means of communication. And so in a sense the language reflects our bodily experience, our mental experience, our emotional experience. So language is very potent, positively and negatively. I think also, if you want to say everyday life is broken up into sequences or episodes or situations, I think if you don't isolate a problem, then each situation becomes a challenge by degrees. Like, how am I going to get through this situation? I mean, if you travel, how am I going to get through that situation? If you're going to meet somebody, etc., or you're going to paint a picture or read a book. Even reading a book, which is very passive, you're enjoying it, but in your mind, in your emotions, in your memory, you're dealing with something you've not experienced before, you've not read the book before, and you're going to be taken on a journey. And the same with dreaming as well. And dreaming can be very disastrous and very challenging. But again, what makes people give up? What makes people make a problem and block their way through that problem? They avoid, they digress, they deviate, and I think living is, for the individual person, is a matter of navigating a very complicated situation all day long, basically. Of course, you're sitting quiet or you're enjoying music. I'm not saying complication in the sense that it's a problem. That's what I'm actually trying to say. That the word complication may appear to be the term of a problem, but I'm not using it in that sense. And I'm not saying there aren't problems to be solved. But I'm saying the situation, you could say, in an open way, is a problem to be solved. You go into the kitchen, you want to come out with a cup of tea. I mean, the problem, but I'm saying, in the sense of a problem, is something, that you avoid or you can avoid, and you don't want to, you can't solve the problem, you don't have the means of solving the problem, like the panic attack. There's no solution to that when you're going through it. It's so immediate, so powerful, so intrusive, that you're immediately out of your depth, like a trapdoor opening. You're immediately in a life and death situation. And you want to get out of it, you want to, you wish it never happened, or that kind of thing, or as with any dangerous situation. So we could say, what is danger? In a sense, it seems to me certain people actually seek danger and risk, like climbing a mountain, going solo across an ocean in a small boat, etc. I would say I've never sought risk, I've never sought that kind of crisis or danger, but I've had quite a lot of danger in a certain way. But mainly because of my lifestyle. My lifestyle for most of my life, my adult life, was moving around a lot, never knowing quite where I'm going to go, and just deciding overnight to go from one city to another, to live here, to live there, in different countries, with different people, always unpredictable, never quite knowing how I'm going to survive. And I lived like that for about 20, 30 years. And that kind of, you might say, disturbance to the organism, to yourself as a whole, again, is something I lived through. I didn't do it I didn't live like that to achieve anything. I lived like that because that was how I managed to feel free and to create a space in my life where I could be spontaneous and creative. So I had to put up with very difficult conditions. And even now, today, my future, I may have to decide to put myself into quite difficult situation or difficult conditions. That probably will happen. But I don't perceive it as a problem. Because as soon as it's a problem, then you're turning the living condition, you might say, into something else. It's like you're abstracting yourself away from it and creating kind of a psychological reaction to that and looking for a solution. Whereas I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't actually do that. I'd take the rough with the smooth. I remember in the 70s, I was in Oxford. I was at the Krishnamurti conference. I met a couple of people, one from America, one from Amsterdam. and the American was staying with the guy in Amsterdam, and I went over to see them. And the first night I got there, I had to sleep in a hotel, and I was very upset, very, very, I wouldn't say psychotic, but very, very upset. I just got into the hotel and I just felt I couldn't cope emotionally, psychologically. But I managed to get through the night, and I expressed that to the two people next day, and they didn't seem to be that interested or that concerned. But I don't know why I was in that state at that particular time. I don't actually know why. Whereas I've been on my own in the Himalayas in India, I've been on my own throughout my life into very difficult situations, but that particular situation, I don't know what happened. In the same way, you're living and then suddenly there's a panic attack and you think, what's that? I have no idea what it was, where it came from, and then have a void experience. And it's the same way that you can get frightened if you're quite psychic and you see apparitions and people see ghosts and poltergeist around the house, knocking and banging around the house. Well, I've had a lot of those kind of things. And more or less, I'm all right. In the middle of the night, apparitions coming, people walking around the room, and all kinds of demonic stuff, and gods and goddesses, and all kinds of stuff I've seen in my room. And I'm awake and just looking. And sometimes, if I get an image and I become very focused on it, it becomes very intense. I feel if I continue to focus on that image, I'll be taken out of my body. And I always resist that. I always become frightened of letting go. Now, in the spiritual tradition, that kind of fear wouldn't be acceptable. I mean, if you read the spiritual books, someone like Krishnamurti, for example, he would see that as a massive problem, that you've got fear of letting go of your identity, for example, because he believes in uprooting fear, and he feels that fear is actually one of the main constituents of the self, of identity. The fear of being detached, the fear of losing the sense of self, the fear of losing consciousness. For him, he could do all of that. He could lose his consciousness, he went into altered states, etc. My view is that fear is not a problem. Any psychological state, any psychological behaviour, emotional behaviour that's part of the human being, that's part of the human condition. I have no problem with any form of condition, any form of behaviour. And if you're afraid, then you're afraid. And if you don't want to become unconscious and let go of your identity, etc., then that's perfectly all right with me. So I've lived all my life with fear, and I don't find any problem with that. And in fact, it's got nothing to do with my spiritual work. So I don't see anything psychological as having anything to do with my spiritual work. So I've never mixed up psychology and spirituality, for example, whereas Krishnamurti, his whole focus in freeing what he called the universal mind from consciousness with with its ego self-identity. That was actually the whole procedure that you had to go through. And I would say all of that's irrelevant. So when I used to listen to him talk over years, I mean, I never took anything he said seriously. And I've just been listening to a number of YouTube dialogues with David Bowie and other things. And I still feel the same. I think he's on the wrong track. I think he's not communicating properly to people. I think he's getting the psychology absolutely wrong. I think you should leave people alone with their psychology, leave people alone with their emotions and behaviour and their interior world and internal world. I think it's intrusive. That's why I don't like psychoanalysis. I think anyone trying to read someone's mind or get into someone's head and change them from the inside, I think that's absolutely wrong. If you're prone to fear, if you're prone to be depressed, if you're prone to be a bit psychotic, etc., and you live with that. And if it gets too much, you go to the doctor. But as I say, I don't believe in getting rid of anything. I don't believe in dissociating yourself from anything or changing your memory or changing your consciousness. I don't think any of that's the right way to approach spiritual problems or spiritual the spiritual field. So you might say, well, what relationship has spirituality to living? And as I say, living is complicated on every level, physically, emotionally, psychologically, etc. I think all of that, the human condition, human behaviour, I think that's organic and natural. So to me there's no problem there. There actually is no problem there. And if you make problems, you make problems, but for me there is no problem there. So when I went through this psychotic interlude and this sense of void and losing identity and feeling afraid and feeling out of my depth, all of that, I came out of that. I lived with it for a long time, many weeks, months. I got through that on my own and I felt liberated, I felt really ecstatic, and it was very, very noticeable in my life. And I hadn't read any spiritual books, so I didn't know it was it had a relationship to spirituality. And then I read the books, and that's more or less the initiation or process or dark night of the soul, etc., going into the underworld. That's very typical spiritual process. And so they say you go from the dark to the light, you go from the unreal to the real. And then once I read the books and realised, yes, that's the process. It's the same way, as I say, about a panic attack. If you read up on it in a medical book, then you'll find out what they think about the panic attack, and that seems to be a process or something. So obviously, in our conscious mind, we want to know what's going on in certain cases. I don't get too carried away with worrying about my psychology. I mean, I know enough, and I've studied things enough, but because I like learning, I like being aware, I like learning, I like being intellectual. So I think to identify the process you're going through, like as a child, I couldn't identify that it was an out of the body, and that was only when I was grown up. But so spirituality for me is organic, it's natural, and it may or may not happen to a particular person. And it may be simulated by reading books. You may imagine it. You may wish for it to happen. You may practice meditation or go to a spiritual teacher or go to an institution or whatever. But I maintain that spirituality in reality is a living, organic process. And it either happens or it doesn't happen. So when I came out of that situation into the light, as it were, then I learned that it was a form of enlightenment. It had to do with satori and samadhi and emptiness and the one mind, etc. And that sense of myself being free is the essential realization of that process for me, and that fits exactly in with the Zen idea and the Tibetan Buddhism. So I know it's an authentic process, and I know that I went through that, and I've been self-aware in my own space, as it were, in my own sense of mind, the one mind, for 50 years. Now, in my consciousness, in my behavior, in my conditioning, nothing has changed. I still have the fear. Right now I can see it. That doesn't bother me, because I don't mix up consciousness, psychology with spirituality. To me, spirituality either happens or it doesn't. I'm not saying there aren't, how can I say, spiritual effects. I mean, if you get into the theory of it, into the theory of spirituality, there are spiritual effects like synchronicity, revelation, visions, dreams, theophany, epiphany. Yes, there are lots of what I would call spiritual effects that Carl Jung said are brought about by the archetypes, or brought about by sources of activity that the conscious mind doesn't know about. So science doesn't know about it, and we in general don't know about how psychic experiences work, how synchronicities work, how revelation works, and yet it's documented over thousands and thousands of years. So we know it's authentic and it's real and true, but rationally we can't prove it. I mean, there have been experiments in parapsychology that convince the people, the experimenters, that it is actually provable. But no, I mean, there's spiritual activity which is like an effect, but I'm talking about the quintessential fact of what spiritual awareness, spiritual realization, self-realization, that fact I'm talking about. When the Buddha went into nirvana, that actual fact is different from Buddha living his life on the earth, as it were, and moving about as a human being. It takes you outside of the reference to consciousness as we know it, and the identity that we have. But having gone through the process of distinguishing self from identity and ego, then everything's in place. The body's the same, the ego identity is the same in consciousness. I mean, I remember myself perfectly well, everything I've done. When I can meet my family or meet friends and just go about as normal, absolutely normal and ordinary, hasn't changed anything. Whereas Krishnamurti said, there is no Krishnamurti, there is no personality. He doesn't have any problems of a psychological nature. He's eliminated the psychological self, the psychological ego. And obviously he's not making the distinction between self and ego, which is, to me, the essence of spiritual awareness. So I would say, psychologically, actually, you don't have to do anything at all regarding spirituality. I think spirituality is creative, spontaneous, that is revelation, dream, visions, epiphany, even awakening, even the awakening of the self or the liberation of self. All of that's organic, natural, and spontaneous. So you could say, at the deep level of the psyche, you've got creativity in terms of people being inspired to do paintings and writings and science and insights into science and doing paintings and all of that. You've got the deep level inspiration, intuition and creativity. Now, that's very subjective, very personal. Now, if you go deeper into the level of the archetypes, into the level of the void, then there's a creativity that is beyond the realms of consciousness. It's not something you can be conscious of. It's coming out of an unconscious or unknown, I think unknown's a better word, an unknown depth of creativity. Just as the physical universe came out of an unknown depth of creation. It's exactly the same. So you've got the creation of the physical universe, you've got the creation of the psyche, you've got the creation of culture and art and music, and you have the creation of spiritual activity. But there's only one point to be made about spirituality, in my estimation, according to the way I read the text. That is the liberation or awakening of self. So when your self is free, then you can look at the human condition, you can look at living with complication, living with behaviour, living with conditions. You can just look at that and live with it. You are what you are, and life is what it is, and you live through the conditions, or you make particular things into problems, and then, in a sense, split off from the living condition and make it into an isolated problem. And I'm saying, yes, if you're writing a book, that's a particular kind of problem, or you're doing a scientific experiment, etc. Or if you go to the doctor and they make your psychosis into a depression or into a schizophrenia or something like that. And then you have all those added complications. So not everybody can be organic and natural and just live through things. But I'm saying you can do that. You can live through crises of any kind, physical, psychological, emotional, mental. I mean, if I decided to leave here, which I plan to do, if I decided to leave here, because I don't know where I'm going to go from here in the near future, but if I decide to leave here, and I just got on a train somewhere and just went somewhere to stay for a while, yeah, I could go through a crisis of some kind. I might go through an emotional crisis. I might enter a psychotic level, I don't know. I really don't know, because I am what I am. I mean, I haven't changed from the age of 4. I am what I am. I have phobias about heights. And I don't find that a problem. I don't want to get rid of it. I don't think it's something negative or something inferior. And as I say, if I have to go through some physical crisis, emotional crisis, psychological, mental, so be it. I mean, I am what I am. Nothing's changed. Because I feel in myself I'm free, doesn't change my bodily condition and the condition of my consciousness whatsoever. Doesn't make me more moral or more courageous or more responsible or anything like that whatsoever. They say sometimes that if you're in a car accident and as the accident begins, say you're skidding on an icy road and your car is going out of control, spinning around, and you see before you a wall or a tree and you know you're going to have an impact. They say that everything slows down and you're not afraid. It's like you're just watching it in slow motion and you're not afraid. And then it happens and you could have an out of the body, or you could find yourself in that situation. There was no fear, there was no pain or anything. And maybe later when you're taken to hospital or whatever, and there may be pain. But that's how I feel about self, like as I sit here now. If I feel free in myself, and the freedom in self isn't a freedom from anything. I'm not free from my conditions, because as I say, my living conditions, my consciousness is exactly the same. So I'm not free from that. And I'm not free from anything. It's just a state of freedom. It's just a space of freedom. And that's what I'm saying. A crisis is occurring in your consciousness, but your self is free. But the impact on your body and your consciousness in a crisis will be what it is. I mean, it will be what it will be. You live through it, the rough and the smooth and the positive and negative. It's got nothing to do with the freedom of self. Self doesn't do anything. Self isn't like consciousness. It's not like I can do this and I can do that and I can deal with this or I have to do that. No, self is self. Just free. So you might be lying in a hospital bed and everybody around you is in some state of mind or some emotional state of mind and in a state of reaction. But I could lie there and just look out of the window and see the beauty of nature, because I have that freedom. In other words, self is not in consciousness. Self is not ever in a crisis, because self is free. The same way, you're in an operating theatre, having surgery, and people say they're out of their body, looking at their body being operated on. And that's what I'm trying to say. Whatever, I'm not saying that's exactly the same as self being free, because it's an altered state. And that's what Krishnamurti, I believe, is in. He's calling it universal mind. but I think he's in an altered state where he's dissociated, because that would be an altered state is a dissociated state, because you're dissociated from your body or from the actual conditions going on in your life. So I feel that Krishnamurti's spiritual attitude is evasive and escapist, and actually avoiding the reality of his self in the world. So he eliminates self, and then in a sense becomes totally depersonalized. Because if you don't have a self and a psychological self, then you've totally depersonalized yourself. But anyway, so you're floating above your body in an altered state, and people say from that they feel then they won't die. They've gone out of their body, so they feel they've survived their body. But that's an altered state. That doesn't actually prove to yourself that you'll survive death. It's an altered state. When you go into a dream every night, that's an altered state. It doesn't prove that you'll survive death. I think we will survive death, but I'm just saying. And also my experience of self in the one mind doesn't prove to me that I survive death, because it's embodied, it's right here now. I haven't gone out of my body, I've never gone out of my body, so I can't say categorically that I'm going to survive death, because my sense of liberation is in the here and now, whereas Buddha, that went into nirvana, went into the transcendental aspect. So yes, there probably is a transcendental aspect to the one mind and samadhi. I haven't done that. I haven't been into that situation because I haven't let go, because I'm afraid of letting go of my body. But if I was in an accident or something happened to me, maybe I would go out of my body. But that would be an altered state. So being free in yourself isn't positive or negative, isn't happy or sad, it's not psychological, it's not comparable to anything. It's a very, very unique experience or unique condition. There's no explanation for it. Other people have documented that in the past. I think it's very authentic. But what that is, in terms of, say, physiology, in terms of the brain, in terms of science, in terms of psychology, I have no idea how I got into this state. But having read the text, I understand it, and I know it's authentic. And because it's non-psychological, there's no fear, there's no problem. So if you, as I say, if you're in an operating theatre, or you're in a car crash and you're out of your body, as it were, and you don't feel the pain, you don't feel fear, you feel free, you feel, then you know what that is, you know what that feeling is, but very few people will know what that is and how they got in that state and what is that state. But we know people do that, and I'm saying, having read the text, I know people have gone into what I've gone into and have exactly the same understanding of the mind. That it's a real, the mind is a real place or space. Nirvana is called the resting place. It's a real place that in which you are as a self. So you're yourself in the dream, you're yourself driving a car, and you're yourself in the mind, in the one mind. But you're not doing anything. other than seeing. You're just seeing, or being aware, or being whatever, however you want to describe it. Does being liberated make life easier? Of course not. Because the conditions are the conditions, and your behaviour is your behaviour. And you learn to adapt, and you learn to go through the complication. It doesn't get easier. I mean, in the sense that, you might find things more complicated because you don't understand the situation. Of course it gets easier in that sense. But living in general, the unpredictable things in life, anything can happen at any time. And you're not protected, you don't have any specific defense. Being self-aware doesn't make you any more aware of consciousness. It doesn't give you any control over consciousness. It doesn't give you any there is no sense of knowledge. You don't have a sense of memory and knowledge that you can use to navigate the world, or you can use to control your consciousness or behaviour. You've still got to go through what you've got to go through with other people and situations. I mean, if you use the term art of living, I would say, yes, I think the art of living is learning to live. And you learn to live from the time you're born to the time you die. Which is, for the animal, adaption, day by day adaption. The animal has to deal with unpredictable situations with other animals, with the seasons, with the weather, all of that, every day. Anything can go wrong at any time for an animal. The same with a human being. So you learn to play an instrument, and you learn to play it well. And when you can play it well, then you learn to listen to the subtle reality of the music. And I've heard many people say in music that they're always hearing it differently. They're always finding something to listen to notice, because it's very, very complex and subtle if you're listening to, say, classical music. In the same way, when I go out in nature every single day for 2 hours, I'm just absolutely absorbed myself in silence, in oneness. I just see the totality and am absolutely absorbed and fascinated every day, all of the time. Even though I'm not feeling that good, I might not be feeling that good, but I never lose my total attention, the freedom of my mind to be at one with everything. So if I go down the river, when I look at the world around me, when I look at the trees and the river, I see everything as one. I see everything as a totality. So everything I'm seeing is enfolded in the mind. And the mind is not limited to any given space. So the space around me in the sky, the mind enfolds that space in its emptiness. Now, so I'm seeing literally the whole of what I'm seeing is enfolded in the mind. And if you imagine, if you go in a museum and you're looking at a painting, and there's a big canvas on a white wall. So if you imagine the canvas to be the world I see when I'm walking down by the river, the whole of the world around me, that's the canvas, and the mind is the white wall. The mind is not just beyond the periphery of the canvas, beyond the periphery of the sky. The mind goes beyond the universe, beyond all reality. So if you think of the one mind objectively as enfolding all of reality, multiverses or dimensions, in the same way that the mind enfolds all the totality of what I'm looking at. So when I'm walking down the river and I'm looking, I can see literally the whole texture of everything. So I literally can feel, sense in my body, my mind, my feelings, my intuition, everything, the whole functioning of my organism. I can see everything at once. So all the colours, all the textures of the trees, of the leaves, of the sky, of the clouds, of the water, I see everything at once. So if you go in the gallery and you're looking at this big picture and it's on a white wall, and say you're an art historian, so say you know that painting 100%, you know every single detail. Now when you walk up to that picture and you're a connoisseur, an art historian, and you look at that painting, you see everything at once because you know every single detail. Whereas a person seeing it for the first time, I mean, it's overwhelming, it's a big canvas, they don't know where to focus, and so forth and so on. So I'm saying that when I walk down by the river, I see the whole thing all the time. So the mind sees the totality within the one all of the time. And then I can look. So if I'm walking down and I'm in meditation, which is the one mind, there's no meditator, it's just yourself meditating. Then as I look at the river and I see the ripples on the water, and I sense the wind blowing on the water, then when I'm looking, I'm not directing myself. The self, myself, I'm not choosing to look at that water. Whereas if you're looking at a painting or you're walking down by the river and you're just observing in your consciousness, you say, oh, you look at the bird and then you look at the tree and then you look at the water and you think about this and that. When you're in meditation in the mind, you're not directing where you're going to look, what you're going to focus on. And so you might say the mind does what it does. It does what it does. So say you're a passenger in a car and you're driving through the countryside. You're not driving the car. So the car goes to the left, goes to the right, and you just look wherever the car's going. And that's just like the mind. When you're walking around in meditation, the mind, as it were, is looking, pointing things out. And some of the things that you look at spontaneously, creatively, are not always what you see with your senses. So if you're looking with your consciousness and you say, oh, that's a tree, and that's a building, and that's so-and-so, and that's so-and-so, when you're in the mind and not using your consciousness, sometimes you don't know what you're looking at. I mean, we call it a tree, we call it a river. So I remember one time in Oxford, I'm walking along by the Oxford Canal, and I take a path towards the Thames River, and as I approached the Thames River, when I saw the river, I moved, my mind moved into a place of silence. So that river was silence. Not that the river was silent, but the river actually was silence. So what I would say is the mind has spiritual perceptions because it's a spiritual reality. It has spiritual perceptions. And one of the spiritual perceptions or the qualities of the mind is silence. And so when I'm out in nature and I'm walking around, I am in silence. But at the time in Oxford, I probably it was in my consciousness, and as I walked towards the Thames River, I moved into my mind, as it were, and that movement into my mind, out of my consciousness, as it were, then I moved into silence. So the river was existing within that silence. That's why I saw the river as silence. I mean, you know, if you see a bird, you can see the bird as freedom. I think most people might experience that in their consciousness, but in the mind, when you're looking at the world around you and the wind and the colours and the river and the birds, I mean, the most important thing for me, the quintessential quality of the mind is freedom. So you literally see the freedom in not only nature, but you see the freedom in the world of society and culture and the city. Or you see the freedom in the momentum of history, in the momentum of the human species on the planet, and the whole reality of the stars and the cosmos. You see everything as a movement in freedom. And in that mind, there is only freedom, there is only space, there is only compassion and love and beauty. But whether I'm occupied in my consciousness or in the mind, I don't compare the two. It's all part of my life. So I don't make preferences or play off spirituality against consciousness and conditioning, whereas Krishnamurti does. He makes that comparison, he makes that division. So it is a kind of superior-inferior division. So the self and consciousness and conditioning is imperfect, and the universal mind is perfect. Whereas I think that's an arbitrary division. I don't think it's like that at all. It's not meant to be compared. Buddha, yes, he went into transcendence, but he was an ordinary person. He was with his family and friends, and he lived a normal life, as far as I can see.